We have been at this facility in Waynesboro, Virginia since 1995. It is incredibly environmentally conscious. The building is powered by geothermic generators. There are about 5 different heating and cooling zones, depending on which room you're standing in. For our larger patients in the hold, like the bald eagles and the owls, they need a much cooler temperature, so their room is a lot cooler than the room across the hall where all the babies live, and which is kept generally about 8 to 10 degrees warmer. And all of that is capable because of this kind of complex heating and cooling system that we have built back in the 1990s. The reason why this building had so much attention is because it is the largest outdoor flight pen in the eastern United States. And its sole purpose is to serve as a rehabilitation structure for bald eagles. And as a result, we see a great number of injured and orphaned wild bald eagles at the center every year. His name is Buddy. He is not human imprinted. He's not scared of us. That's because he spent most of his life in captivity. But at the same time, he's not exactly attempting to win our affection or favor either. He was hatched on a webcam in the Norfolk Botanical Gardens, and there are a bunch of webcams out there now around the world, many of them in the United States, that focus on wildlife. And some of the more popular wildlife webcams happen to be eagle cams, as they're known, and Buddy was hatched on one of these eagle cams. Now, eagle cams are human-installed cameras out in the wild that basically focus in on a specific nesting site throughout the course of a year. And throughout the course of that year, about 6 months, that nest is vacant and unoccupied. But starting in the winter and stretching through the early summer, that nest will play host to, as a rule, a pair of mating nesting eagles, and people can watch as they first lay eggs, and then usually the mothers will incubate the eggs until they hatch. And then people can actually watch small eaglets grow up to be juvenile birds and until they're old enough to fly away from these nests.
I'm ColinMehaffey, on-site reporter for Fairfax Academy News. I'm here with Davis Rogers, an outreach coordinator for the Virginia Wildlife Center. Davis, what is it that you do here?
Yeah, I'm Davis Rogers from the Wildlife Center of Virginia. I am an outreach coordinator here, and that basically means my job is broken into 3 components. I do a lot of the writing for our website, so I basically write patient stories about kind of current interesting patients that we have, and I keep them updated, so anytime there's new medical news or new stories that people want to be interested in, I write those. I also am in charge of training a lot of our educational birds, some of the ones you have seen so far. So I train them to become less wild and more patient in the presence of humans and not intimidated by us as a rule. And then the third thing I do is I kind of combine both of those previous jobs, and I take educational programs out around the region in West Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, and I basically do educational programs for people to teach them to care for and about wildlife.
In general, what kind of animals do you work with here the most?
We tend to treat native wild animals to Virginia, and that ranges from small things like baby squirrels, baby rabbits, baby songbirds, all the way up to the largest animals you find in the state, which are eastern black bears. We also are the only facility in the state that works with bald eagles, so we get a lot of the largest raptors, and of course we get the biggest birds in the state, which are not bald eagles, they're actually wild turkeys, and we get a lot of those too. So any wild animal that you can see outside is what we would treat here at the center.
What exactly is wildlife conservation, for those who don't know, and why is it so important?
Right, so wildlife conservation can take many forms. Conservation for us means educating people on the intelligent ways of interacting with our wild neighbors. And it can take place in a very impromptu, informal basis over the phone when we have a panicked person calling in because they found an injured animal in their backyard, or it can take place in the more structured programs like that I perform, where we use wild animals that are trained as kind of educational examples, and we kind of give a very structured presentation to generally students kind of going through and breaking down how conservation works.
Most of the time when you hear about conservation, they're talking about all the great things in California and Yellowstone and all those well-known national parks.
Right.
Is there any real difference between what happens out there and what happens here?
Yeah. Every state has a completely different set of laws that govern conservation within that state. And believe it or not, Virginia has some of the strictest laws in the country involving human interactions with animals. And the Wildlife Center, where we are currently seated, is one of the big reasons for those kind of strict animal laws. Virginia has actually been kind of the leading state, at least at the state level, conservation, at the forefront of conservation for about the last 25 years. And a large part of that has been our interactions as well. We have a very good relationship with the state agency in Virginia that manages wildlife, and that is the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. For example, I was kind of mentioning this earlier when we were watching our doctors work on the baby black bear. Last week we signed an agreement with the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries that will enable us now to be really one of the only wildlife centers in the state that can handle orphaned baby black bears. Previously, there was no real policy as to what to do with baby black bears, but because there are so many of them that are now being found, this year alone we have seen 6 that have been brought to us that are orphaned, that are tiny, that need some sort of relationship with other wild black bears. And now we are going to be the facility in the state of Virginia that handles all of those baby orphaned black bears. And so it's a little bit different than what you've described, like in California or in some of the larger national parks like Yellowstone. But that's because in Virginia we have smaller amount of space and more people as far as population density is concerned. So our relationships with nature tend to be different than the relationships that happen in those parts of the country. And as a result, we do have a different set of laws, but they tend to be incredibly strict in how they govern a normal person's interaction with wild animals and with protected places.
Just as a wrap up, why is conservation so important in Virginia?
So conservation is important everywhere, I would like to point out. But in Virginia, of course, we are a state that has a relatively high population. And we have a relatively high population that is kind of condensed in mostly one part of the state. If you look at a population map of Virginia, the majority of the people who live in Virginia tend to live in the northern and kind of eastern parts of the state. And then we have another large section of the state in which the population density is not nearly as high, but we have lots of kind of open spaces. What that means is that in the state of Virginia, we do have a lot of wild species of animals who are competing constantly with humans. As the population numbers in the northeastern part of the state and the eastern part of the state grow too large for their areas, the people are constantly moving, kind of expanding out. And that means, of course, that there is always going to be interfacing between wild animals and humans. And for us, conservation really does mean trying to educate people as they come more and more contact with wild animals on how those interactions can resolve in a way that not only preserves the wild animal's integrity, but also allows people to live in a space that kind of shares on territories with wild species. It's tricky. There are a lot of states out there that have such a massive amount of land and such a small number of people in comparison that conservation takes on a whole different flavor in those areas. Alaska, any kind of spot in the kind of direct western part of the country. But conservation in a highly populated state like Virginia really involves a lot of people management as well as wildlife management. And for us, people management means just teaching them, giving them the opportunities through our website, through our Facebook page, through our educational programs, to not only care about wild animals, but understand that they can actually cohabitate with all sorts of wild species, and the reaction doesn't have to be a negative one for either one.